lab, which I switched. So now this is going to be due a week from today. Click on that in the week 3 module. This is going to be the document that you'll fill out. And then this is that YouTube video that just gives a breakdown of how to juggle. If that doesn't work for you, you can find a different one. I don't have any affiliation to this, but it was just the first one I found. And then, let's see, now the actual lab. And I know I just put this up a few minutes ago, so you didn't have a chance to look at it, but I'll just go through it instead of adding a whole separate lecture up. So stages of learning, it should be Kine 312. This lab's going to be worth 12 points, and this is another way to get extra credit throughout the quarter. So it's going to be a little interesting doing it. But so basics of the lab are you're going to learn to juggle, or try and learn to juggle, and you're going to go through all the steps of learning, categorize yourself in the different stages based on the 2 models that we talked about. And in order to get the extra credit, there's 3 options. If you can juggle 10 times in a row, you can get 1 point extra credit. 20 times in a row, that's 2 points. 30 times in a row, that's 3 points. And that's anytime throughout the quarter. For the sake of how we're going to do that, you can either come to Katie or my office hours on Zoom and do the juggling that way, or you can film a video of yourself juggling 30 times or however many times, and submit that, email it to us, and then that way you'll get that extra credit. Other things with that. So this is, again, kind of a good introduction to your project, which I'm hoping to get to you by the end of this week. Stuff won't be due for at least 2 weeks or so, but that way you can start thinking about it. Is learning a novel skill. So if you already know how to juggle 3-ball juggling, I want you to try either 4-ball or 5-ball. So if you can already do like 30 or so 3-ball juggles pretty easily, go ahead and switch to 4 or 5, YouTube that, and that way you're actually learning a novel skill. And then looking at this, so that's the purpose. Instructions, so you're going to be practicing 40 trials a day. Each trial is successfully caught tennis balls, soccer, or not soccer balls, rolled up socks, whatever it is that you're catching. As soon as you drop one, that's the end of a trial. And then you're going to be counting how many times you catch, and that's going to be your record. So each catch is going to be 1 point. Not a full all 3, but every time you catch a ball, that's 1 point. So you're going to be doing that 40 times a day for 5 days. And after every 5 or so trials, you're going to be writing some comment. So these are the basics of the comments. It doesn't have to be each of these. It doesn't have to be one of these, but it has to be something that you're thinking about. So it's basically what are things that you want to address? What are things that you're thinking about? What are things that you're focusing on? Something cognitively about that trial set. Then you're going to write this all, some directions. You're going to write this all in here. So you're going to do day 1, trial 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The score is just how many catches. You're going to take the average of all 5 of those and then write a comment for each of these. The comments can't be, this was hard, and then draw a line down. So you can't say this was hard and then draw a line and say, keep saying this was hard. Think about it, answer one of those questions, trying to improve in some way. The last comment is going to be something like a reflection on your, and that's up here, a reflection on your experience. So summary, what is your experience? What were your findings? Whatever it is, That'll be that last question. So is this making sense for what the lab is, you're supposed to do with the lab? Kind of? Okay. Talking about the questions really quickly, just because sometimes this is confusing. I am going to see if this works. So for all of your trial blocks, you're going to, and of course that's not going to work. You're going to break it down and make a graph. So on the graph, there's going to be 40 different points on it. The 40 points are not per day. There's just going to be one graph. And then like this would be number 1, this would be number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then day 2 would be 9, 10, 11, 12. So you're breaking it down not by individual day, but we want to see a trend over the 5 days. And instead of having, 40 times 5, you're just having 40 blocks on that graph. Does that make sense of how that's going to work? Okay. So you're not doing stats for this lab. You're just kind of looking at it, the graph, in that way. So that's number 1, calculate all of that, make your graph, make an appropriate graph. Number 2 and 3 is looking at your comments. You're going to say where you ended up in each stage. So it doesn't have to be, black and white, I'm in this stage, but you can consider those different components of each of those stages, and say where you ended up in Fitz and Posner for number 2, and then Gentiles for 3. And then important, make sure you talk about if you were diversifying or fixating and why. Is juggling an open or a closed skill? What do people think? I feel like I'm gonna put it in the comments below. Like I'm an influencer here. So it is a kind of a tricky question. So in terms of just what it is, the actual movement, it's a closed skill. But like what Alyssa is saying is once you add different components and once you actually try and juggle, you'll see that you are not static. You are not standing there. You're moving. You're going to end up moving forward and having to adjust to things in the environment. So it's kind of in the middle. And that's because you have to end up moving. It's kind of more of a closed skill if you're super skilled at it and you are able to stay static. But for most of you, if you're not skilled jugglers, it'll become kind of in the middle there. But still talk about, in your experiences, are you diversifying or are you fixating? And then number 4, you're just going to read these things in the textbook. Choose which of these, so changes in muscle coordination, energy costs, whatever it is, describe your changes based on your comments. So making sure that you're writing those comments and addressing the comments for those as well. And that's the lab. That's the lab for this week. So pretty fun. Making sure you're actually stopping and making those comments, and then doing it like for 5 days. Any questions? All right, and then this is again a good practice for your project. So as you're doing this, you can think about, for something that you would want to learn, how are you able to quantify yourself? So how are you able to measure changes in your performance, as well as changes in your learning? And then kind of where you could stand in those stages of learning. This is basically just like a mini, very, very mini project that we'll do. There'll be a lot more components to our actual project, but good. So any questions about anything that we've done so far? The labs that we've done, lectures that we've done, anything. So I'm almost, well, I'm not actually. I started grading your first labs yesterday. I got through a couple, and then I know Katie's been grading as well. So we're gonna be trying to have those done by tonight. So trying to get a week turnaround. Other announcements. So Dr. Hall, who has taught the class for the last, I don't know, 20, 30 years, is going to be teaching the lecture on Thursday and Tuesday, but she's not able to make it at this time. So she's going to record the lecture and send it to me, and I'll post it on Canvas. But what she wants you to do, and what I think is a really good idea, is to go ahead and start reading chapter 5. So chapter 5 is going to be broken up into Thursday and Tuesday, which is the motor control theories. Thursday is going to be Schmidt's schema theory, or the cognitive processing theory. Tuesday will be dynamical systems theory, which all of these words probably are don't make much sense, but reading they're concepts that are kind of hard to understand. So reading it's going to be important beforehand. So at least read that cognitive processing component of that chapter 5 by Thursday, and then go to that dynamical systems by Tuesday. And I'll send an email out when that lecture's up to be watched. Sorry, it's not live. And I'll talk about it next Thursday as well, just since it can be a confusing chapter. I'll leave some time for questions and clarifications. And then our exam is on the Tuesday after that, I believe. So we have this class Thursday, Tuesday, Thursday, and then an exam. And that's going to be on everything that we've talked about so far. And we'll probably, again, look like multiple choice, a few short answer type / essay type questions, and then maybe some fill in the blanks. I will work on that probably next week, and then get a better understanding of the breakdown of how many questions and all of that sort of thing. And that will be required to be present at the time. So it's only going to be available for this time, 12 to 1:30, just for test security. If you have some sort of legitimate excuse where you cannot make it at that time, then just let me know and we can work it out. But it does need to be, you do need to let me know, and it needs to be some sort of legitimate excuse, but again, just talking to me. So that's the introduction for today. The lecture today is not super long. Hopefully it'll be pretty straightforward. We talked about some of the stuff before, so it's really just narrowing down some of the points that we've talked about before, and then thinking of some explanations. I do have a YouTube video that I saw that was pretty interesting, not necessarily on the like details of what we're talking about today, but it brings forth that the concepts in more of a real world situation. So if we have time, I'll play that at the end, or I'll also just put the link up so you can watch that on your own. It's a TED Talk. I think it's like 11 minutes long. So, but it gets you thinking about learning versus performance and how those things are important at different points of learning a skill, as well as it's important to be able to understand the distinguishing characteristics of it so that you can alter your approach to that day, practice session, testing session, or competition session to actually learn or perform based on what you need to do. So it'll make more sense as we talk here, but here we go. So objectives here, learning to distinguish between performance and learning. There's 6 characteristics that are observable as we learn a motor skill. Being able to describe different methods for assessing motor skills, and then talking about reasons that performance might hide the true learning of that motor skill. I have a little cold, so I might be taking little cough breaks as we go. No fever though, so I don't think I am at risk for coronavirus or COVID-19, so hopefully. So first things here is learning versus performance. So we're talking about the definitions here. So performance is in that moment. So it's the execution of a skill at a specific time period in a specific location. So performance is really how you're actually performing in that moment, but doesn't really have any information about the amount that you've learned of that skill. So it's in that moment, how did you perform? Which is different than learning, which is an actual measurable change in the capability to perform a skill, which is inferred from a relatively permanent improvement in performance as a result of practice or experience. So that's the actual definition. So you need to have practiced this skill. There needs to be a change in your capability to perform that skill, and it needs to be permanent or relatively permanent. So these things are done by practice, mostly by practice and experiencing different situations in which this skill should be utilized. And then relatively permanent is that it's not just a fluke. So you're not just saying, oh yeah, I can, trying to think, I went bowling. I'm not a bowler, but I went bowling a few years ago, I remember, and it was the first time I bowled in like 3 years probably. And I was an exchange student. I was in Belgium. It was the first time I was hanging out with these people, and they bowled what they call a turkey, I think, which is like 3 strikes in a row. And people were just amazed. They're like, you're such a good bowler. Wow, that's insane. But that was a fluke. I do not know how to bowl strikes in a row. The next time I went, I probably bowled like 60 or 70, like very bad. So that didn't have any indication of my learning. That was more of how I performed in that moment. It just happened that I got lucky that I did well in that one bowling experience. And that's different than learning, is how much have I improved over a period of time, and that's due to that practice. So why do we need to distinguish between performance and learning? So what are reasons that we'd have to, why do we care? Why can't we just say, yeah, you did better, maybe you learned it, maybe you're just doing better that day? If someone wants to say something, or if people want to write in the comments. Okay, so to know what someone's foundation is, so that we can see how practice, so if we're doing like learning a skill, so yeah, to track progress in a learning skill. So we have to have some way to know where they started and then how they're able to progress, right? And then doing that multiple times could help the individual as well progress, evaluate their progress in learning. So that's also really good. Is like for my weight training classes, I make them do a goal, which is something that they can just track throughout the quarter, so that they can learn to do something better. That's more strength goals, but yeah, so good. So we're not just looking at that one moment. We're able to distinguish where they started, how they're progressing, and then where they're ending. So it is really important, and you'll see in a lot of the research that this is something that is addressed a lot, is this learning and performance, but really what we care more about is the learning. Yeah, so learning can lead to better performance, not always the other way. So yeah, sometimes better performance leads to learning. Sometimes better performance is just a fluke and you have no idea what you did, so you have no idea how you're going to do that the same way. Good. So other components of performance versus learning. So performance is going to be the actual execution and performance of that skill in one location in one time. So how you did at practice that day, how you did when you bowled that one day. It's observable. So it's something that you can say, this is how you performed this day, based on some sort of results, a score, a time, how many errors you made, whatever that is it's observable behavior. And then it can be influenced by performance variables. So performance variables are going to be things like crowd noise, the weather, how much stress you're under, how much caffeine you've had, if it's wet outside, if your shoes are wet, if there's a hole in your shoes. All of these things are going to influence your performance on that day. If you're trying to play tennis and it's wet outside, you're going to slip a little bit more in that court, which is going to influence your performance, but it's not necessarily going to influence your learning. So learning, it's not directly observable. We can't look at one thing and say you have learned this much, or you are learning in this moment. It's inferred from that observable behavior. So it's looking at changes and tracking progress over time, or trials, or whatever the x-axis is. You're inferring learning based on that observable behavior. So you're able to observe certain performances, comparing that to other times or dates or experiences, and saying that learning must have occurred because this is happening. It's due to practice, so it has to be something that's due to practice. It's not just, doesn't just happen. It's not the reaction timing. And that could be physical practice, could be mental practice. Those are things that we'll talk about later as well. And then it's not influenced by performance variables. So just because it's raining outside does not influence the amount of learning that has occurred. It'll influence your performance on that day, but not the innate learning that's occurred. There we go. I don't make these PowerPoints, by the way. Anyone who's known me before, I'm sure you could tell that I do not make these PowerPoints, but I have someone to do that for me now, because the publisher PowerPoints are really boring. So these are a lot more fancy than what I would make. So characteristics of learning a skill. So these are things that happen that I guess tell us that we have learned, or their learning has occurred in a skill. So these 6 things. So improvement, and a lot of this stuff we've talked about. We talked about on Thursday, and kind of do this because we're looking at those stages of learning, so you get a good basis of how people progress. And then now we're looking at how we're actually measuring that learning. So I think that it's kind of hard to decide which one goes first. I like doing it this way just because you've gotten that introduction to learning, and now you're learning those specifics about it. So improvement is really You're just improving your performance over time. So you're increasing your performance over time. That one's pretty simple, is in order to learn a skill, you have to get better over time. And that's that improvement. So your score is better, you're faster, you're making less errors, whatever that is getting better over time. Consistency, you're becoming more and more consistent. So like what we talked about in Fitz and Posner, when we looked at the consistency, the movements that you're making are becoming more consistent, and the scores that you're getting and the errors that you're making are more consistent. So they're staying pretty stable, pretty much the same over time as you're progressing in that learning. Stability has to do with the ability for what they call perturbations, for internal or external factors to affect your ability to perform that skill. So things like stress, weather, like the speed of stuff, what's going on in the environment. So environmental or like stress, what you're feeling, your caffeine, that sort of stuff. Stability is that you're more well equipped to perform at the same level, even with those components that could affect you. That makes sense. So at the beginning of learning, when you're not very skilled, high stress situations might make you do worse. But as you're getting better at this skill, stress is something that might not affect you as much, or the weather might not affect you as much, or the crowd might not affect you as much. And you're learning to be able to consistently and accurately perform this skill under many situations. I think that makes sense. Persistence. So the increased ability to perform this skill continues over periods of time. So you're doing this for long periods of time, and it's not just a fluke. So it's not just one time you're doing really well, and then the next time you're going back down. It's any improvement or the improved performance capability is going to be seen over long periods of time. So that's when we're talking about retention tests, is that it's persisting, it's staying there for long periods of time. Adaptability, improved performance is adaptable to a variety of performance and context characteristics. So you can do this regardless of what's going on in the environment and what's going on in the context of that situation. You're still able to adapt your performance to remain successful in that skill. And then reduced attention demands. There's a reduction, and this is what we talked about with the autonomous stage as well as the later stage in gentiles. There's reduction in the amount of attention that's demanded to perform the skill. So you can do this while talking, you can do this while focusing on something else as well as that skill. It doesn't take up all of your conscious attention. And that, again, will last longer. So those are those 6 characteristics of skill learning. Does anyone have questions about those 6? Does that make sense? And it's, again, thinking back to those stages of learning. That's a good, you see those are things that we've already talked about, but now we're just narrowing it down into definitions. Stability. So stability and adaptability. So stability is that there's less of an effect of either external or internal perturbations or things that could affect it. There's less of that effect. So things in the environment will not decrease your performance of that skill once you've gotten to that point, versus adaptability is you're able to alter your performance depending on what's necessary for that movement, and still be successful. So I think of it as like stability is crowd noise is not going to affect you as you're getting better and better. And then adaptability is you can have a defender coming at you in basketball and still adapt your movement to remain successful in that skill. Does that make more sense now? Okay. Yeah, some of it's kind of very similar. There's a lot of similarities between them. But thinking about it in that, I think makes more sense to me. Okay, so different ways that we can assess learning. So these are different things that we'll be doing and you'll be learning about throughout the quarter. Research is huge, using a lot of these different things. So the first one is observing practice performance. So really just looking at how or if there is a difference in the performance of that skill during practice. So what has changed during that skill? And is that improving as you're watching it? And then a big part of that is that you're recording the skills, the performance. So not only observing, but you're recording how it's being changed. And the simplest thing that you could think of is if all you do is look at a graph of how someone is changing. So if they're playing darts, we're just looking at score. We can look at a graph that looks like this of score is increasing over time. We're not having to do any sort of test transfer, but we can look at that increased ability over time. And then we have retention tests. So I think I have, we'll talk about this more towards the end, but retention tests again are the, that's measuring that persistence. So we're measuring the persistence of the increased performance over time. So is it a fluke? Can you just increase your performance, or after a period of time without practicing, are you still able to perform at a higher level than in the beginning? And that's that retention, is measuring that persistence. Transfer is going to be kind of measuring that adaptability, where you're looking at, can the improvements be transferred to a new skill that's similar to the previous one, or a new situation that you've never seen before? So can you adapt what you've learned? Can you include what you've learned in the improvements into a new skill or a new situation using that previous skill? Coordination dynamics is really going into what we talked about a lot of with Bernstein's, the freezing and unfreezing degrees of freedom is in coordination dynamics. And that was that whole trying to make the ellipse where you're moving your hands in and out of phase. But when you start learning, you're typically trying to use a previous motor pattern or previous movement from a different skill. And then eventually you coordinate to be able to more effectively utilize your movements, your muscles, your joints, both with economy of effort and in the correct way. So less muscle activation, more correct muscle activation, to show that you can do this at a better way and have that coordination between your limbs. And then dual task procedure has to do with the attention demands. So there's a lot of tests where they look at how much attention can you put on something different as you're doing this skill. So as you get more skilled, you're able to put more attention on something completely unrelated than if you were not. So what they'll typically do is like a counting thing. So they'll say, all right, dribble this basketball with just your left hand and now count backwards from 100 by sevens. And the more skilled you are at basketball, the easier that is, because you're not having to put the attention on the dribbling, but now you can think of the math. But in the beginning of basketball, typically both things will just stop. You'll either stop counting or you'll stop dribbling because you can't put enough attention, your attention's split and you can't put enough attention on either of those tasks. So that's that dual task procedure. So these again are just different ways that we can actually assess learning compared to just observing practice performance, which is what typically people do if they don't understand the necessity of other tests. So then we're looking at performance curves. So there's ways that we can observe practice performance, and I guess I went into details of all of those things when there's graphs for each one, but that's okay. So performance curves, we're looking at line graphs that are going to plot how you've progressed over time or over trials. So this is what you're doing in your stages of learning lab, is you're making a line graph of your progress over 5 days of juggling to see if we can measure improvement, measure consistency, can measure a little bit of variability, but are you increasing? Is your graph going up, or is your graph going like this where there's no consistency, or is your graph in the beginning and then eventually you're kind of going like this where you're getting to that point where you're getting more consistent as well as improving in that skill. So we'll talk about a couple different performance curves. So this one is that root mean square error. So this is going to be on that continuous task, which is we're looking at less error is better. So that's something that you always need to do when looking at performance graphs, is think about what is being measured. So some things are going to be like this where you want to be down. So things like error, if you're doing time in terms of how quickly you can do something, you want the graph to be going down, versus if you're doing score or time that you can last doing a tracing skill or whatever that is, you want to make sure that goes up. So that's really important as you're looking at all these graphs. Understand, is it better to go down? Is it better to go up? So this one is better to go down. And this is pretty simple to see that there is a change in learning without doing a retention or transfer test. So we can see at the beginning, there was this huge decrease in errors. So a huge improvement here. And then at this point, there's a pretty high amount of variability as we're getting here. We're still seeing a general trend downwards, but there is a pretty high variability in this moment here. But after about 23 trials, we're getting pretty consistent at this point, and we're still getting better. So yeah, there's points where we did better, but that wasn't very consistent, and now we're getting to the point where we're consistently doing better. So that's one thing that we can see there. And then other things in performance curves are showing the rate of performance. So linear is saying that proportional increase over trials or time. So as you progress in the amount of time that you're doing this, or the amount of trials, you are getting better. So you're just getting better as you're going. Each time you do it, you're getting better. Keeping in mind that all of these are smooth, that a more actual would be more kind of less consistent here, but they smoothed this out to make it more easily readable. So a negatively accelerated is this one here, which we see in the beginning, we get this huge jump in performance, but as we progress in time or number of trials, the amount of improvement slows. So we're getting to the point where we're kind of plateauing and we're not improving as fast or kind of at all. And then the opposite would be positively accelerated, which is in the beginning, you don't see much improvement, and then a little bit, and you kind of hit this point where all of a sudden you're just improving, getting this huge improvement here. And then the S-shaped one is kind of both, where you're not getting a lot of improvement, getting this huge jump, and then at the end, slowing down that improvement. So what are experiences that you all have had that follow one of these curves? Can anyone think of one? That you're just improving every time you do it, improving a lot in the beginning, and then kind of hit a funk. So weightlifting, yeah, so once you start weightlifting, you're getting pretty good, right? There's a huge jump from someone who's never done anything before to someone who's weightlifted for 3 months, 4 months. And then in terms of like, what am I trying to say? In terms of form, you're not going to get that much better once you've gotten kind of to that point. That's a good example. What about a positively accelerated? Has anyone thought of that? Where you go, go, go. Okay, yeah, so juggling. So juggling is a really good example, which some of you will see is at the beginning, it's really, really hard. But once you understand that basic concept of what you're doing, then you're getting to go from 0 to like 5 juggles is really, really hard, but to go from 5 juggles to 15 is pretty easy, or easier. And then to go from 15 to 30 is pretty easy because you're just keep on practicing. So good. So there's these different ways that you can look at the performance of a skill, just measured on a curve. Good. So performance for kinematic measures. So this one we're not going to talk about too much, but this is something that is hard to do over time because it is so kind of continuous. So you have to break it down into time or trial blocks, and then typically it looks something like this, which really all you have to know here is we're looking at, so on this graph, we have the mean, which is that solid line, and then these dashed lines are standard deviations. So if this is our goal movement, we can both look at the changes here. So, you know, this looks a lot better, and then a smaller standard deviation is going to tell us that it's more consistent. And you can kind of just tell with these graphs that this one looks a lot closer to this one than this one does. So just different things. Didn't want to go too in depth of that. So then retention. So we already talked about this, but so it assesses the performance level achieved during practice. So in all or in most good motor learning biomechanics research, there's going to be either a retention or a transfer test. You need this test to see if there is actually learning that's occurred and that it's not just a performance a performance effect or a learning effect. So typically you wait a specific period of time. A lot of the times that's kind of just arbitrary, but you want to make sure that none of the performance influences can have an impact on that performance in that retention test. So most of the time between a retention, the time between performance and a retention test, there's no practice of that skill to see if it's just been ingrained in our brains, which Thursday and Tuesday you'll understand more of where it gets ingrained, or if it was just you're improving that in performance. Yeah, so that's typically what's going to happen is waiting a specific period of time. Occasionally, people will say taking away feedback could be a retention or transfer test after a certain period of time. But typically, I consider that more of a transfer test because you're altering certain components of the performance of that skill. But some people will say it can be argued that that's a retention test where you're just having them perform it on their own. And then transfer test is looking at how adaptable you are to performing that skill in a new situation or a different variation of that skill. So what we typically do is we have you do a it's called an anticipation timer, where we set a certain speed that you have to click a button on when it hits a mark, click a button, and we look at your errors. And we have you do like 4, 7, and 9 miles per hour. And then the transfer test is 6 miles per hour. So you've never seen it, but you got better in the 4, 7, and 9. So we're seeing if your ability to do that skill, which is push the button and anticipate where that's going, can be transferred to a new speed that you've never seen. So yeah, changing the amount of feedback. So if typically every time you do something, you're getting either verbal or visual feedback, you're seeing yourself do it, or someone's telling you this is what score you got. If you remove that, then that could be a transfers, because you're going to have to alter your performance without that feedback. So if you're still able to do well without that feedback, that's showing that you've learned how to do it and that you're not just relying upon that feedback. If you're changing the physical environment or personal characteristics, so you're changing things about the performance of that skill that make you adapt your performance, and if you're able to better adapt that performance, that's showing us that you've learned more. Performance skill is novel variation of the practice skill, so that's a new speed, just something that's a little bit different. Transfer tests are typically going to be more useful in like sports-like situations, right? So if we want to know if you have gotten better at shooting a basketball, we want to know if you've gotten better at shooting a basketball in any situation. So that's where transfer tests are going to be good for that. Is are you only good at shooting the basketball from one point on the court, or can you transfer that ability to anywhere on that court? And that's a lot of that sports skill, is that you're able to adapt your movement to whatever the needs of that moment are. And then, yeah, how might you assess how well a tennis serve is learned using a transfer test? Can anyone think of how you could assess how well a tennis serve is learned using a transfer test? Okay, yeah, so serving on the other side of the court, changing the spot. Yeah, okay, serving in badminton, that's interesting, is changing the actual performance of that. Um, yeah, so everyone has a really good idea is changing where they're doing it, changing the situation that they're doing it, or the actual skill. So doing like a badminton serve, or changing the ball that they're doing it, or doing it in a game-like situation versus just standing still to nothing. So good. So just changing some component of that to see if you've still learned that serve, or if that's just you're getting better at performing it in that moment. Good. So coordination dynamics, again, talked about this. So measuring and observing coordinated characteristics. So we can look at the stability of your pattern and then transitioning from one pattern to the other. So is what you're doing remaining stable? So is your movement staying the same each time? And have you changed from that pre-learned movement pattern that you try and do in the beginning to an effective coordination movement pattern in the end? And is that pattern staying pretty stable regardless of what you're doing? When you talk about um, um, what am I thinking? I can't even think of the word right now. Um, you'll learn it on Tuesday. Think about this. So you'll learn a lot about coordination dynamics when you talk about the dynamical systems theory of motor control theories. But you're being stable in your pattern of movement regardless of the demands of the environment, of the movement, whatever it is. And this is what we had talked about on Thursday is you're able to get better as you go, and become more stable in that movement. So here you are not doing anything near what you wanted to do. As we progress, you're getting a little bit more stable in the movement. But at this point, your movements are pretty consistent, and you're doing that kind of in the same way that you'd expect. So you're changing the coordination of your limbs, of your joints, of your muscles, and able to change that and then remain stable in the change that you make as time progresses. And then reasons that practice performance might misrepresent learning. So there's times where practice can artificially inflate or depress performance. And then there's times where practice sometimes can involve a performance plateau. So there's times where that first one is sometimes practice, it just looks like you're doing a lot better. But when you transfer or do a retention test, you're not actually learning. So in the moment, and we'll talk about this when we talk about practice variability and contextual interference, there's certain ways that if you do this one skill over and over and over and over again one day, you're going to get very, very good at that one skill, at performing that skill on that day. So for the most part, people have experienced that. You're only practicing one shot all day, and you get pretty good at performing that shot on that day. But what's not happening is an increase in learning. So if you try and do it from a different spot or in a different time, different environment, you're not actually showing the same rate of improvement. And a lot of that has to do with the demand on your brain to actually make yourself do that movement is not very high. So you're kind of just getting complacent and you're just going through the motions versus actually having to think about and deepening those, what a tractor well is what I was talking about before. attractor wells and memory traces, so things that actually store the learning of that skill. And then practice may involve performance plateaus. So there's times when you you technically still be learning, but are just not improving your overall performance. Yeah, so that's what we'll talk about here. Or can you not improve your performance without improving learning? So in terms of, that's a good question, Emily, and this is what we'll talk about here. So in terms of practice plateaus, there's times where, so we're saying that we are learning, right? So in the first 5 days, we are getting better. So we're decreasing our root mean square error because we're starting to learn. But from day 5 to 7, we're hitting this plateau where it looks like nothing's happening. So nothing is happening in our performance, but that's not meaning that we're not learning. So, and the book does a good job of describing this as maybe you're trying to figure out, maybe you've realized that what you were doing before wasn't working, and now you're trying to figure out a new strategy for movement, but you haven't been successful at it. So that's what this day 5 to 7 is you're still learning, but you're not actually showing that learning through increased performance until you've figured that out or changed one little thing. And then you're getting this pretty significant increase in performance afterwards. So just because you're not necessarily increasing performance on that day does not mean that you're not learning. Because if you make performance or practice harder, sometimes that challenges yourself to increase learning, but you're not going to be showing that in the performance because too much is going on for you to successfully do each little component. But you're learning to adapt to more things, to be able to transfer that to more situations, and then retain that information for a longer period of time. Does that make sense there? So does everyone understand the difference in learning and performance? Are there any questions? So I'm just going to play this video because it is interesting in that it talks about, the title is When Performing Gets in the Way of Improving. And I think it's really interesting to think about of how in our society we are so stuck on the performance components. So we want to do better in that moment. We want to get an A on an assignment. We want to do anything, whatever it takes to perform well. And that sometimes it's harder to actually learn things because a lot of times you have to decrease your performance in that moment. So I'm going to play this. And let's see. So I'm going to share screen. I'm going to do this one. Okay, try one more thing here. New share. Can you hear it? Okay, perfect. And see it? Okay.
Most of us go through life trying to do our best at whatever we do, whether it's our job, family, school, or anything else. I feel that way. I try my best. But some time ago, I came to a realization that I wasn't getting much better at the things I cared most about, whether it was being a husband, or a friend, or a professional or teammate. And I wasn't improving much at those things, even though I was spending a lot of time working hard at them. I've since realized from conversations I've had and from research that this stagnation, despite hard work, turns out to be pretty common. So I'd like to share with you some insights into why that is and what we can all do about it. What I've learned is that the most effective people and teams in any domain do something we can all emulate. They go through life deliberately alternating between two zones, the learning zone and the performance zone. The learning zone is when our goal is to improve. Then we do activities designed for improvement, concentrating on what we haven't mastered yet, which means we have to expect to make mistakes, knowing that we will learn from them. That is very different from what we do when we're in our performance zone, which is when our goal is to do something as best as we can, to execute. Then we concentrate on what we have already mastered and we try to minimize mistakes. Both of these zones should be part of our lives, but being clear about when we want to be in each of them, with what goal, focus, and expectations, helps us better perform and better improve. The performance zone maximizes our immediate performance, while the learning zone maximizes our growth and our future performance. The reason many of us don't improve much despite our hard work is that we tend to spend almost all of our time in the performance zone. This hinders our growth, and ironically, over the long term, also our performance. So what does the learning zone look like? Take Demosthenes, a political leader and the greatest orator and lawyer in ancient Greece. To become great, he didn't spend all his time just being an orator or a lawyer, which would be his performance zone, but instead he did activities designed for improvement. Of course, he studied a lot. He studied law and philosophy with guidance from mentors, but he also realized that being a lawyer involved persuading other people, so he also studied great speeches and acting. To get rid of an odd habit he had of involuntarily lifting his shoulder, he practiced his speeches in front of a mirror, and he suspended a sword from the ceiling so that if he raised his shoulder, it would hurt. To speak more clearly despite a lisp, he went through his speeches with stones in his mouth. He built an underground room where he could practice without interruptions and not disturb other people. And since courts at the time were very noisy, he also practiced by the ocean, projecting his voice above the roar of the waves. His activities in the learning zone were very different from his activities in court, his performance zone. In the learning zone, he did what Dr. Anders Ericsson calls deliberate practice. This involves breaking down abilities into component skills, being clear about what sub-skill we're working to improve, like keeping our shoulders down, giving full concentration to a high level of challenge outside our comfort zone, just beyond what we can currently do, using frequent feedback with repetition and adjustments, and ideally engaging the guidance of a skilled coach, because activities designed for improvement are domain-specific, and great teachers and coaches know what those activities are and can also give us expert feedback. It is this type of practice in the learning zone which leads to substantial improvement, not just time on task, performing. For example, research shows that after the first couple of years working in a profession, performance usually plateaus. This has been shown to be true in teaching, general medicine, nursing, and other fields. And it happens because once we think we've become good enough, adequate, then we stop spending time in the learning zone. We focus all our time on just doing our job, performing, which turns out not to be a great way to improve. But the people who continue to spend time in the learning zone do continue to always improve. The best salespeople, at least once a week, do activities with the goal of improvement. They read to extend their knowledge, consult with colleagues or domain experts, try out new strategies, solicit feedback, and reflect. The best chess players spend a lot of time not playing games of chess, which would be their performance zone, but trying to predict the moves grandmasters made and analyzing them. Each of us has probably spent many hours typing on a computer without getting faster. But if we spend 10 to 20 minutes each day fully concentrated on typing 10 to 20% faster than our current reliable speed, we would get faster, especially if we also identify what mistakes we're making and practice typing those words. That's deliberate practice. In what other parts of our lives, perhaps that we care more about, are we working hard but not improving much because we're always in the performance zone? Now, this is not to say that the performance zone has no value. It very much does. When I needed knee surgery, I didn't tell the surgeon, poke around in there and focus on what you don't know. We'll learn from your mistakes. I looked for a surgeon who I thought would do a good job, and I wanted her to do a good job. Being in the performance zone allows us to get things done as best as we can. It can also be motivating, and it provides us with information to identify what to focus on next when we go back to the learning zone. So the way to high performance is to alternate between the learning zone and the performance zone, purposefully building our skills in the learning zone, then applying those skills in the performance zone. When Beyoncé is on tour, during the concert, she's in her performance zone. But every night when she gets back to the hotel room, she goes right back into her learning zone. She watches a video of the show that just ended. She identifies opportunities for improvement for herself, her dancers, and her camera staff. And the next morning, everyone receives pages of notes with what to adjust, which they then work on during the day before the next performance. It's a spiral to ever-increasing capabilities, but we need to know when we seek to learn and when we seek to perform. And while we want to spend time doing both, the more time we spend in the learning zone, the more we'll improve. So how can we spend more time in the learning zone? First, we must believe and understand that we can improve, what we call a growth mindset. Second, we must want to improve at that particular skill. There has to be a purpose we care about, because it takes time and effort. Third, we must have an idea about how to improve, what we can do to improve. Not how I used to practice the guitar as a teenager, performing songs over and over again, but doing deliberate practice. And fourth, we must be in a low-stakes situation. Because if mistakes are to be expected, then the consequence of making them must not be catastrophic or even very significant. A tightrope walker doesn't practice new tricks without a net underneath, and an athlete wouldn't set out to first try a new move during a championship match. One reason that in our lives we spend so much time in the performance zone is that our environments often are unnecessarily high stakes. We create social risks for one another, even in schools which are supposed to be all about learning, and I'm not talking about standardized tests. I mean that every minute of every day, many students in elementary school through colleges feel that if they make a mistake, others will think less of them. No wonder they're always stressed out and not taking the risks necessary for learning. But they learn that mistakes are undesirable inadvertently when teachers or parents are eager to hear just correct answers and reject mistakes rather than welcome and examine them to learn from them, or when we look for narrow responses rather than encourage more exploratory thinking that we can all learn from. When all homework or student work has a number or a letter on it and counts toward a final grade, rather than being used for practice, mistakes, feedback, and revision, we send the message that school is a performance zone. The same is true in our workplaces. In the companies I consult with, I often see flawless execution cultures, which leaders foster to encourage great work, but it leads employees to stay within what they know and not try new things, so companies struggle to innovate and improve, and they fall behind. We can create more spaces for growth by starting conversations with one another about when we want to be in each zone. What do we want to get better at and how? And when do we want to execute and minimize mistakes? That way we gain clarity about what success is, when, and how to best support one another. But what if we find ourselves in a chronic high-stakes setting, and we feel we can't start those conversations yet? Then here are 3 things we can still do as individuals. First, we can create low-stakes islands in an otherwise high-stakes sea. These are spaces where mistakes have little consequence. For example, we might find a mentor or a trusted colleague with whom we can exchange ideas or have vulnerable conversations or even role play. Or we can ask for feedback-oriented meetings as projects progress. Or we can set aside time to read or watch videos or take online courses. Those are just some examples. Second, we can execute and perform as we're expected, but then reflect on what we could do better next time, like Beyoncé does, and we can observe and emulate experts. The observation, reflection, and adjustment is a learning zone. And finally, we can lead and lower the stakes for others by sharing what we want to get better at, by asking questions about what we don't know, by soliciting feedback, and by sharing our mistakes and what we've learned from them so that others can feel safe to do the same. Real confidence is about modeling ongoing learning. What if, instead of spending our lives doing, performing, performing, performing. We spent more time exploring, asking, listening, experimenting, reflecting, striving, and becoming. What if we each always had something we were working to improve? What if we created more low-stakes islands and waters? And what if we got clear within ourselves and with our teammates about when we seek to learn and when we seek to perform, so that our efforts can become more consequential, our improvement never ending, and our best even better? Thank you.
So kind of interesting, right? Of putting learning and performing, not just in motor skills, but in normal life, and how much of an emphasis that we do put on performance. And you'll see this in when you think back to all your sports skills, sports practices, that kind of thing. Most of the time, partly from not knowing better, but a lot of it's based on that performance of increasing performance in that moment, without necessarily knowing that um, that it might not be improving learning to the same effect that it could be. So just think it's that was an interesting little video, and something that we do encounter all the time is how do we change, how do we challenge ourselves and be okay with failing in that moment, even though it's going to improve our performance later on, because we're actually learning things. So any questions? Does anyone have any questions? So the next two lectures will be done by Dr. Hall. I will be available for office hours on Thursday after class, and then on Tuesday um, before class. And I'll, as soon as she sends me that lecture, I'll put it up so you can watch it whenever you want. Come ask me questions, and we will talk about it on the following Thursday. So a week from this Thursday, we'll talk about the chapters as well to make sure that you do understand it. But please read that chapter 5, because that's a really good chapter and helps break it down. Especially read those little sections at the top that gives the examples, because that's what I found was the most helpful when I was trying to learn it, and then trying to teach it is reading those sections. Keep up with reading and in labs, and let me know if you have questions. But I'll see you all again next week. But I will have those two lectures up as soon as she gets them to me. So, and I'll have labs graded as well with, I'll put some comments on the labs for things that could be better, but overall people are doing really, really well on the stats lab. So good job, and we'll see everybody in a couple weeks or in a week.